Happy Friday, everybody. Welcome to the Damien Jones podcast. Today is a wonderful, wonderful day, a blessed day. I hope that everybody is well. I hope that everyone is social distancing. I hope that everyone is spending time with their family. I hope that we are wearing our mask when we go out. But glad that you are here with us today. This is the Damien Jones podcast. I'm your host, Damien Jones, where we talk about news, politics, and life in a fun, uncensored, and unadulterated way. We have a very, very good show for you today, as we will discuss Black masculinity, defining Black masculinity from Ahmaud Arbery to Lil Boosie, in the ways in which those things connect together. So come on in the room, come on in the room for a good lunchtime chat. Tag some people who you think need to listen to this conversation. If this is your first time with us today, really, really, really appreciate you. Thank you so much. Go ahead and hit the like button and let us know you're here, or hop in the comments and just say, hey, Damien, I'm here. I'm ready for the conversation. If you are a regular viewer, go ahead and hit the heart button right now and let us know that you are present and that you are here and you're ready for the conversation, and tag someone as well in the comments. Before I bring on our esteemed panel of scholars on this particular issue, let me just run through a few things really quick. This has been an exciting day. You know, we had Joe Biden in his comments on the Breakfast Club saying that if you still are trying to figure out whether you're voting for me or voting for Trump, then you ain't Black. And so those were the words from your Democratic nominee, Joe Biden. So I will take time on Monday to unpack that statement. We also saw former mayor of Detroit, Kwame Kilpatrick, was released from jail today on a release program. So I think that is something to keep your eye on as well. But I just want to say this, people, COVID-19 is not done. COVID-19 is not over. Please continue to wear your mask. I see folks out at the different parties, at the different eateries, at the different clubs and so forth. Be careful, social distance, wear your mask, because hospitals are filling up at a higher rate than they were when this thing first began. So I think it's important that we use this platform to be responsible and say that. Also, as we talk about politics a lot on this particular show, elections matter. And so in Texas and in other places, elections are upcoming, but COVID has forced us to probably have to vote by mail. So it's important that we check our mail and that we make sure we cast our vote by mail and we get that in, because elections matter. They're important. November's coming up. So make sure you get that in. If you have not got your census in as well, make sure you get that in as well. If you want to see some of our previous content, visit IamDamienJones.com. So you can get some of our previous shows, our previous content. We've had some really good shows about politics, shows about stocks and trading and finances, shows about mental health and so forth and so on. And so really, really, really thank you all for joining us today. Continue to add people in the comments. Let us know you're here. We're going to have an interactive conversation. Y'all got to talk to us. I'll put your comments on the screen as well. But let me bring in our panel for today on the Damien Jones podcast as we talk about Black masculinity. And so he is bringing in my esteemed panel today. So first joining us is Dr. Marlon Smith, who is an author and a lecturer at the University of Houston. Dr. Smith, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, of course. I appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. And next we have Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, who's a professor at California State University at Fresno. Dr. Johnson, thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And last but not least, who has made time all the way from the UK, is Professor Tommy Curry from the University of Edinburgh. Do I call you Dr. Curry or just Professor Curry?
Dr. Curry's fine.
Yeah, that's all.
Either one.
I want to be sure you academics will cut my head off if I don't say doctor. So thank you, Dr. Curry, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Smith, for being here today to have this robust discussion. Folks, make sure you are sharing this broadcast as well as we get more people into the room, and keep your comments coming as we talk about Black masculinity. So we saw what happened with Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. We saw his untimely death, his untimely lynching. We also saw that one of the family members of the alleged murderers shared a picture of his body as it lay after they murdered him. And we see this oftentimes in the way Black male bodies are treated and discarded as well. But then on the other side, we also saw the situation with rapper Little Boosie as he talked about positioning his young sons and his nephews and so forth to become a man, if you will, or that rite of passage. And he set them up with a older woman to have some level of sexual intercourse as a way to begin to develop his manhood, right? And so the question comes, how do we define masculinity on that end, but also masculinity in the world, whereas white folks and other folks feel intimidated by Black masculinity, gripping your purses when they see us in the elevator and things of that nature. A Tamir Rice seen as a monster as a 12-year-old. How do we define Black masculinity? And so I'll go to my first question. And Dr. Curry, I'll start with you, and all of you can weigh in on this. What do we exactly mean? So we can bring people up to speed. What do we mean by Black masculinity? Well, masculinity, but in particular, Black masculinity. How do we define that, Dr. Curry?
Well, this is a very difficult thing to define. For a large period of American history, Black men were not even considered men. And when I say that, I don't simply mean that they were denied the identity of being men. I mean they were defined as other things. So in the late 1900s, Black men were largely referred to as females. In the evolutionary scale, Black men were thought to be on the level of intelligence as a small white girl. Everything about us from the 1800s forward was about our femininity, our primitiveness, our savageness. This is why we couldn't be good fathers. Even into the mid 20th century, going to 1960s and 70s, Black men were thought to suffer from female personality disorders. They were thought to run away from homes. They were thought to be more prone to homosexuality because they were not really men in the sense that America had defined those values. The conversation that we have about Black masculinity and what it means today really starts from kind of the baggage of these racist social science debates where Black men have been denied manhood, so they're willing at any cost, right? This is the language of Bell Hooks when she's describing the Central Park Five, at any cost to prove that they're men in American society that will commit any kind of atrocity or insurmountable amounts of violence to show their manhood. These are largely fictions. When we're talking about ethnographies that represents the views of Black men, we find that Black men don't really use the term masculinity, but manhood, that they describe themselves as being communal, spiritual, race first, having a kind of resilience against the struggles and barriers of white supremacy, being good fathers, being good role models. These are the values that Black men, when we actually interview them and study them ourselves, talk about. A kind of manhood that resists white masculinity, that resists racism, and is very, very much communally oriented. I think the kind of debates that we've been seeing in popular media about toxic masculinity come from a kind of pop cultural commentary on Black men, not scholars or people who actually study or involved with Black men, either as victims or in terms of their interviews or primary research. And these things draw attention to violence, aggression, misogyny, homophobia, etc. But when we actually look at the Black population, none of those ideas or attitudes are unique to Black men or boys. So I think when we talk about Black masculinity. In my work, I use Black maleness. And we're talking about an assortment of identities, straight, gay, different religions, Christian, Islamic, agnostic, different class positions that are trying to deal with both the situation of vulnerability as victims of a white supremacist violence and as a living world where their husbands, brothers, fathers, etc. In a world today.
So let me bring Dr. Johnson in there. If can you help us, Dr. Johnson, just kind of piggyback on what Dr. Curry was saying and just help us define masculinity in particular, or Black masculinity?
Well, I think Dr. Curry laid it out there. I think the only thing that I would add to that is it becomes an issue of authorship. Who gets to determine what aspect or what frame we use? And for the most part, in mainstream media, as Dr. Curry was talking about a moment ago, the reference to Black men is often attributed to Western or mainstream perspectives on Black masculinity. And when we factor in more feminist notions that come about, in the 1960s, 70s, and especially in the 80s, the perspective on Black men becomes kind of homogenated into this notion of manhood as a general category. So when you begin to talk about things like patriarchy, you begin to talk about things like toxic masculinity, Black men get thrown in with white men, and you just get this hodgepodge of manness or masculinity that is supposed to somehow apply to all Black men across class, context, region, language, you name it.
Let me stay right there, Dr. Johnson. When you just mentioned that Black men and Black masculinity is kind of grouped into that thought with white men and their behaviors as well. Can you walk us through what's the difference?
Well, I mean, one of the differences is black maleness, as Dr. Curry was referring to, is actually developed in response to this Western masculinity that we've been, homogenized into in the popular imagination. We actually develop our manhood in response to that. So it's not a matter of Black men internalizing white values and acting like white men, historically speaking. And this is something Dr. Curry brilliantly lays out in his text, The Man Not. It's actually much of what you see in the history of particularly ADOS, African-American Black men. They're responding to this kind of, domineering, patriarchal, oppressive masculinity coming out of the West. We're responding to that, and we're responding to it by actually invoking a justice that we ourselves have not been given. And yet, when you get to this popular imagination about masculinity as a whole, there's not a parsing out. There's not a particularism that takes place where people say there's a difference between the two. What we hear is it's all the same kind of thing. So by the time you get to intersectionality theory, you do have this gesture at attempting to particularize Black masculinity, but in the end analysis, it ends up reaffirming Black men's relationship to white masculinity. And we just become perceived as this kind of boogeyman that oppresses off of an agency extended by white society.
Yeah. Beautiful. You're laying it out. And Damien Jones podcast, folks, in the comments, continue to keep the comments coming. And if you agree with what you're hearing, give us a like. Let us know in the comments. If you disagree, we appreciate that as well. We want to have a robust, respectful, and educational conversation around a important topic. Dr. Smith, I just heard Dr. Curry and Dr. Johnson kind of lay the groundwork and kind of talk about patriarchy. And we often talk about this problem of patriarchy. And sometimes in our discourse, it can be mixed in with masculinity, if you will. Talk about that relationship between masculinity and patriarchy and how Black males are positioned within that mix.
Wow. So I think we're all kind of saying the same thing here. I think one of the things that we have to remember is that the structure of patriarchy, particularly as we know it now in the West, and the definition of masculinity are really constructed through kind of a white lens, a white European lens. And that needs to be articulated very well, because the European structure of a social system was actually the killing and the oppression of Black males. And so the participation of Black males in that is to suggest that we're actually participating in our own killing and our own destruction, which I think in some ways is an insult to Black men as a whole, and Black males and boys. But more importantly, I think something that has not really been articulated very well, particularly in more mainstream media outlets, is that the whole definition of masculinity as we think about it in the academy, isn't really coming out of social science. It's coming out of literary analysis, right? Like we're listening to poets and writers, right? So I'm reading people's work who are referring to masculinity through the lens of reading the book Color Purple, right? Like there's no social science in Color Purple, and so that makes that makes it a little bit difficult.
You can always tell Dr. Smith to shoot some shots.
I'm just saying, but that's the truth. That's really where it's coming from, and even this kind of mythopoetic men's movement really emerges out of a literary analysis, and that's fine because I think I'm a humanities scholar, so I think that words really matter and are important. But I think we need to not confuse them with social science data, and the reason why I say that, going more specifically to your point, so that when we're actually engaging the conversation around patriarchy through works that is literary analysis and from narratives and poems and the like, then what we really don't do is have a real conversation about the way in which patriarchy operates and structures itself, right? So we don't get a chance to ask, how do African civilizations understand the role of maleness in societies compared to Western democracies, right? Like we don't get a chance to have these conversations about the way in which then Black males and boys are kind of groomed to be productions of labor, more so than being full human participants in this in our society. So I just think it's very hard because Black masculinity gets trapped into that.
Yeah, and I think y'all have laid it out pretty. We kind of set the table, but now let me get into the core of this conversation. And I'm going to come to you first, Dr. Smith, but I want Dr. Curry, Dr. Johnson, please jump in on this as well. You know, I know folks who are watching, they saw the flyer and they'd say, what's the nexus between Ahmaud Arbery and Boosie as it relates to this Black masculinity conversation? On the one hand, Ahmaud was unfairly murdered in the street, and we are still seeking justice for him. On the other hand, there's Boosie who has created uproar because he has put himself in a position where a lot of folks are saying he got his son raped by an older young woman, and we've seen all the vitriol as it relates to that, and people are polarized and have lots of opinions on that. But Dr. Smith, kind of tell us, and Dr. Curry and Dr. Johnson as well, what's the nexus between in this Black masculinity conversation of a Boosie and Ahmaud Arbery?
Well, so let me say, first of all, I'm not condoning Boosie by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah. There's so many issues around that need to be discussed that we don't have enough time to do that. But I will say this: the connection between Boosie and Ahmaud Arbery, in my opinion, is the struggle that is both the internal and external struggles and forces that Black maleness has to deal with when presenting itself in the world, right?
What do you mean?
So, in other words, what Boosie to me articulates is the struggle of internal Black maleness that we have to always deal with, what it means to be a man. And I'll give you a great example, because sometimes I know academics, we throw terms around. So let me use a practical way of thinking about this. I was a kindergarten teacher for 3 years in public ISD. And one of the things that I had to constantly wrestle with were, and I don't mean this as an indictment, but really just as an anecdotal experience of dealing with Black mothers who would pick up their sons from my kindergarten classroom. And if there was a Black boy who was sitting at the table with a young girl, then one of the things that I would hear, not one time, but several times often, was, oh, that must be his little girlfriend. And I would have to say constantly, he doesn't have a little girlfriend. He's 6 years old. He ain't got no girlfriends in here. Or I'll hear statements about, oh, he's the little man of my house. He's the man of the house. And I'm like, well, if this 6-year-old is the man of your house, then you have a problem in your home. Because what we really have to then deal with is kind of the internal struggle of what Black boys and Black males have to deal with and what we try to articulate as maleness. And so when we get trapped into that, what you see, in my opinion, is Boosie articulating the kind of, or accepting the kind of trap that Black males have to deal with when it comes to our identities and who we are. And I think the other thing, and the connection to that is the same thing with Arbery. Ahmaud Arbery, which is the kind of external forces that Black males are constantly having to deal with, right? So that we are constantly having to figure out how to present ourselves in a way that we're not only a threat, but then we're not also perceived through these type of lenses that restrict us to these types of labors or productions or sexual beings that have no control of ourselves.
Yeah. So let me come to you, Dr. Curry. What I heard from Dr. Smith is one, hypersexualizing our young males at an early age, and this is a pattern in the behavior that is not just isolated to Boosie, but many people. And then, secondly, what was the second point that you made, Dr. Smith?
So let me just say real quick: internal forces that Black males have to constantly wrestle with, and then these external forces that Black men have to constantly wrestle with.
What are your thoughts on those particular points?
No, I think that's exactly accurate. Listen, I think the link is that on both cases it's fake outrage, right? In the case with Ahmaud Arbery,
fake outrage from where?
From our community, from the world at large.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And let me explain very briefly. Mr. Arbery was killed by two white men who perceived him as being a criminal. This is not new. Every year we see Black men shot by cops, white vigilantes, for some kind of caricature that they're a threat throughout society. Right. As many times as we complain about it, have podcasts about it, talk about it, nothing is done in the ways that we perceive, teach, or embrace Black men in their living lives. As I've said before in several podcasts and in my research, we don't care about Black men when they're living, but we love to perform outrage when they die. Right? Since the beginning of Black Lives Matter, we have seen Black men systematically eliminated by police and white vigilantes, white men and white women who deputize themselves to kill Black men for the safety of the world at large. Every time a Black man gets killed, it's because he was a criminal, or he was in the wrong place, or he was a threat, or we thought he was going to do something. But don't worry, we killed a Black man, so everyone should feel safe. Right? The situation with Boosie is just another caricature of Black men. In no way do I support what Boosie said or did. I study Black men who are victims of sexual violence. So as someone who's dealt with survivors and tries to record their stories, I know that has a lasting impact on young Black men. But let's not make a mistake. Black boys have the earliest sexual debut of any group in the United States. When is
that debut?
They're between the ages, the earliest is between 12 and 14. Their second earliest is 9 and 12. So between the ages of 9 and 14, Black men have their first sexual experience in the United States right now. And most of those experiences are with older women. So the problem that I have with Boosie is that we're trying, notice what happens. On my page, on Dr. Hasan's page, if you look us up, you can see tons of stories being shared about older women, and in some cases, men raping younger Black boys. No, those posts rarely get shared. The research that's talking about Black men expressing the kind of depression, the kinds of anxieties they have because they were victims of statutory rape at a young age barely starts any conversations whatsoever. But the moment that Boosie comes out and says something that I think is deplorable and disagree with because of the effects that I have on children, but is a Black man who's a perpetrator, suddenly the world catches on fire to talk about Black boys who are victims of sexual abuse. Not because they're victimized by older women or men in their community, but because they can now blame a Black man for into these negative values. As much as I say that we need to look at and disagree and critique Boosie, we need to be sure that we're not scapegoating him, he could have possibly been a victim himself, into socializing all Black men into having sex.
So let me hop in. You just gave us a lot, Dr. Curry. Man, you just gave us a lot. Damien Jones podcast. Continue to keep this conversation going in the comments. Let us know how you feel about the information. Tag somebody so they can get this incredible content. Let me come to Dr. Johnson. You heard what Dr. Curry just said, and I want you to just kind of pick up where he left off as it relates to that conversation of demonizing a Boosie and that early rape and that early sexualizing, of our young black males.
No, of course. I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is Boosie, based on his behavior, is more than likely one of the Black males that Dr. Curry was just talking about. More than likely experienced an early sexual debut, more than likely experienced it in a way that may have been emotionally damaged, but the way Black men have adapted to those experiences, we don't often frame it as trauma or damage. We've learned that we're supposed to actually take this on as part of our rites of passage into our masculinity, which speaks to the degree to which this might have been accepted as normal behavior or normal treatment for Black males in and of itself.
Dr. Johnson, pause 1 second. I'm gonna stay with you, but I just want to unpack that and just make it plain. So what you're saying is, you know, we don't condone what Boosie involved himself and his family in, but this is a direct pattern. And men are being taught that this is your rite of passage. This is how you become a man. And the earlier you get connected to that, then the world will begin to see you as this strong man, heterosexual man. And you know, and I know, shoot, as I grew up, we would brag about it. You know, when we would have sexual encounters and things of that nature, especially if you did it at a young age, it was bragged upon. But there's another layer of it that we need to unpack. Now, go ahead with your point.
There's definitely another layer, because it's not limited to, and this is the thing, whenever I hear people talk about this, and this is something I know I experienced at a very young age at 4, and then again at 9, and I've met many Black men who have experienced it at extremely young ages. It's not just something that young boys do, or even that men impose on boys. This has become part of how Black males are perceived. Going back to the stereotypical narratives that come about through slavery, Black men become hypersexualized in a very particular way. And even the data shows us that boys as young as 5 begin to be seen as much older than they actually are. So this is something that has become something that the society perceives Black males as. So you have women, for example, that have bought into that and will impose that on their boys as well. Friends of the family, family members, you know, 25-year-old women who are trying to have sex with 12-year-old boys. I've had men come into my pages just
those are called cougars, right?
No, I think technically cougars are over 40. But that type of relationship to seeing Black males as walking phalluses, that kind of dynamic happens very early on for boys. So it's not, see, this is the problem I had with the discussion on Boosie. We think of it as something older men do to younger men, and you guys just need to work that out. You men need to figure that out. No, this is bigger than that. This is not only happening, you know, in the Black community in terms of what mothers are perceiving in their sons, or family members, or female family members, friends of mothers who want to have sex with boys that they're you know, best girl's son. There's a lot of that happening, and that sexualization of boys isn't just something that men are contemplating amongst themselves. This is part of how we're perceived as a whole. And then you step into the larger society, and the hypersexualization of Black males is taking place in popular culture. So the expectation that boys know how to have sex, boys know how to deal with women, boys know how to objectify themselves basically, and engage that objectification in society. These are expectations imposed on Black boys at a very young age. So the problem with the Boosie discussion is it gives people an out to say, see, that's just something men do to their boys. That basically that's something Black males do to themselves. That's the narrative. But that allows us to deflect from what's actually going on in the larger society, which is much bigger than that.
Yeah. Dr. Smith. No, go ahead, Dr. Curry.
Yeah. The important part here is that the discussion about Boosie denies that Black men are actually victims.
Right.
Exactly. Come on, let's unpack that. We got a good group on here. Let's unpack, you know, in this discussion, how Black men are victims, please.
Listen, so young Black boys are not choosing to have sex at the ages of 9 to 14. They're being older women, some cases older men, are using the fact that Black boys are thought to be hypersexual and older to rape young Black boys. And this is something that has been documented in our communities going back to the 1950s, right? Black communities have always had an issue of sexual debut with young Black boys. So when we're framing this as Black men think it's a rite of passage, you have to understand that because Black boys are not allowed to have a language of victimhood, to not experience trauma, are not represented in any way in any of the protocols for psychologists to treat them, that one of the ways the community has coped with this trauma is that Black men say, don't worry, it's not going to hurt you. It's how you become a man. Nobody is talking about these older women who are raping these Black boys, right? Yeah. You can blame Boosie all you want, but if the woman that he paid didn't do it, then he had
That's a good point.
Right? This is a conversation about what is it in Boosie's history? What did Boosie experience? What trauma is Boosie dealing with that allows him to think this is normal?
Yeah, yeah.
Especially when you factor in that it's more than likely that Boosie saw himself as preparing his sons for manhood and the world. He didn't look at it as I'm oppressing my sons. He looked at it as this is preparation for what the world is going to bring to my sons. That the fact that he has to frame it in that way should tell you this is much bigger than the way we talk about it.
Yeah, yeah. This is so, Dr. Smith. I know I'm coming to you, but continue on this point and just unpack. What's, I always believe in getting to the why. We see the actions of people, whether you murder somebody, whether you make a sandwich, maybe you drive down, whatever you're doing, there's a why to your action. And I think sometimes if it's a bad behavior, we don't look at the why. And I've always been intrigued by the why. So kind of unpack, Dr. Smith, the why of how we got here and what Boosie was thinking in terms of putting his young son in such a position.
Well, see, I think the easy answer to the why is articulated in #BlackAF, right? It's because of slavery. We hate to do that, but if you want to make it very simplistic, you can track the trajectory to the way in which we never think about is that Black male bodies have always been considered, since we've come to the West, have always been considered public property. That is just what Black male bodies are considered. That you can touch us in any way you want to, whether that is hit us, kill us, beat us, rape us, and at some level we are in fact trained to think that we should give our bodies up upon request, because that is what we have been taught. So one of the things that I deal with, my work around Black males has to do particularly around the construction of the Black male felon in the criminal justice system, right? And in my prison, when I ran the prison, one of the things that we found out was that over 65% of the men that were in that prison, Black males and brown males who were in that prison, had experienced some form of sexual violence in their childhood. 65%.
Wow.
Who were incarcerated had already experienced some form of sexual violence in their childhood. So you say, why do these things happen, right? Because what we ultimately end up doing then is normalizing and telling and reinforcing within our culture, within our media, within our families, and within our communities, that Black males are public property. So that Black males, for instance, like, I raise daughters. So here's one of the things that I recognize is that when a woman approaches a Black male, we're trained that we should be flattered by that. And that if she wants to have sex, then we are trained that we should accommodate her request. And if you deny her request, then we are having to then be touted with, well, what's wrong with you, right? But we train young girls to always push away and hold their bodies as sacred, right? And we don't give that same advantage to black males. And the thing that I'll end on this, the reason why that is destructive is because ultimately what we have said to Black males is that you have no real value unless it is something that other people need and want to do. And that in and of itself is dangerous.
Can I add real quick to that?
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Jones.
He's talking about a very particular type of social currency for Black males where their bodies are subject to Black women and other women in larger society as well. They're subject to their use. But we're also talking about that in terms of Black male death. And what Dr. Curry was talking about earlier when he talked about Black Lives Matter, they introduced a different paradigm where Black male deaths could be used politically, but then there was a bait and switch as to what issues that they're used for. And then at the same time, Black males are told they can't hold any significant position in the group. You can't lead. This is, so our deaths become fuel for other demographics, but at the same time, you're not allowed to speak on that. So there's a socio-political kind of currency that comes into Black male bodies in terms of how they're perceived and how they're used that affects us in terms of interpersonal dynamics, sexual dynamics between Black men and women, boys in larger society, and even in terms of Black male death. So when we see Ahmaud Arbery killed, the question going back to Trayvon Martin is who's going to use his death and for what? And I think one of the things we saw happen in the last few weeks, because on my channel on YouTube, Dr. Curry was kind enough to come in and speak on that, as well as a good colleague of ours, Zakiya Sankara Jabbar. And we talked about the ways in which we were not going to allow Ahmaud Arbery's death to become another Trayvon Martin, in the sense that it's used and taken out of context, used for other issues. And yet the group that's most devastated by these kinds of police killings, these types of, vigilante killings, black males, especially, as we understand it, heterosexual black males, those types of killings were not used in the interest of the group that they come from.
Can I add something really quickly? Because I think to that point that we need to expand. Let me give an example of where that happened. And I did a paper over this. Is when we had Hillary Clinton running for president, and she constructed Mothers of the Movement. Okay. When most of the people who were on that stage were grieving over the death of black boys, we had some who were black who were black girls. To be clear, but the majority of those people were black boys. But we totally erased the pain of black fathers and the situations and the conditions in which black males have to exist themselves so that a white woman can run for president, right? So she's running on the backs of black males, right? The death of black males, without prescribing within her political campaign what she's going to do to solve the problem. Because for her, solving the problem was helping the grief of black mothers, not the black boys who were being killed.
And I have to say, that's why I've said very clearly, everybody in the United States can get rich off of black men's death except black men. When black men speak up about their oppression, their marginalization in conversation and politics, we're positioned as if it's some kind of nationalist plea. We have to be silenced, right? But everyone else is allowed to speak for us. And one of the issues with that is that there's no empathy with the situation. Right? There's no empathy on how scholars are approaching the death of black men because they're studying and dealing with objects. Hillary Clinton is making a grand gesture to black women because that's the base of the Democratic platform. But again, this is the same woman who called black men super predators. This is the same woman who thought that boys who come from broken homes had to be put in prison or been brought to heal. So to say that becomes the public face of the conversation about black men and boys, when the very concepts of black men being criminals and deviants rest in language and rhetoric that she had in the 1990s, is not only a contradiction, but it's dehumanizing. Because black men have no position to speak about their own deaths outside of what's going to be valued by some other political interest or some other kind of organization.
Let me ask this.
Let
me ask this powerful conversation. Continue to keep talking to us in the comments. If you appreciate this information, hit the like button, hit the heart button. Let us know you're there and you are engaging with us. This powerful conversation with Dr. Johnson, Dr. Smith, and Dr. Curry on the Damien Jones podcast. You talk about the marginalization of black fathers within that conversation. This is for any one of you. How did we get to that place where Hillary Clinton can have the mothers of the movement and put all these mothers as they grieve, but then just totally overlook the grief of the black father? That's for any one of you.
What? Oh, go ahead, Dr. Curry.
No, go ahead, Dr.
Well, just real briefly, I was just going to say, I think part of the dynamic with that is we have not crafted a vocabulary or a culture around associating black males with empathy, humanity, any of those narratives, let alone having a framework where we can accept black boys and men speaking on their own behalf in regard to our own deaths, which I hope we get to in discussion about this panel in and of itself. Black males. But I think part of the difficulty with that is because we don't know how to associate masculinity, manhood, men themselves with empathy, with humanity. The framework for that ends up becoming articulated through women, because we can empathize. And Hillary knew that. Clinton knew that. She knew how to kind of politicize that in a very particular way. She knew that excluding black men would get her more currency, as opposed to, limit how much currency she would get out of the deaths of those boys. And it didn't have to even engage the boys themselves. So she knew how that framework would work on their behalf. And what it also did is it appealed to black women voters, because they got to see themselves centered in a very particular way, whereas black men who vote, to the second highest level under black women for Democratic candidates were erased altogether. And that was par for the course. We found it acceptable. Nobody raised much of a statement about it, and it was okay. But the absence of this language for how to talk about Black males and Black male deaths, especially from Black males in the larger conversation, is at work here. So one of the things I talked about recently is HBO did a series on the Atlanta child murders.
Yeah, I saw that.
You had a chance to see that. But even in the title, it's very interesting. You would never know that the overwhelming majority of those deaths were boys. The first 9 boys were killed and they were still calling it child murders. But can you imagine if there were 9 girls killed in a row? Do you think they would call it child murders? It would be very particular to race and gender. But we don't do that for boys. Boys just become disposable in a particular kind of way where they can be used for any particular agenda.
Yeah. Wow.
The history.
Go ahead.
And the history of this. We have to think about the history of America. The myth of the absentee Black father was not just a stereotype. The idea going back to the 1920s was that Black men, because they were not patriarchs, could not be fathers of homes. So you get this through the debates about ghetto culture. You get this into the debates about hypermasculinity. One of the reasons that Black boys were thought to be deviant is because their mothers raised them. So they had a scrambled gender personality. They had a female personality and a Black male body. Like, this is the kind of sick science that's coming out of the 1970s and 80s that are framing these discussions about super predators in the 1990s that Clinton's taken a part of. So if the whole structure, if the way that we learn and talk about the world is that fathers are not there, that other Black men are not caring for Black boys, which is ironically one of the linchpin arguments that you get in writings like from Bell Hooks, that Black men do not know how to be fathers, then it's not surprising that when the world tries to speak about Black men and boys, they either do it through white liberals and a paternalistic attitude, or they build some Black women who have historically been the voices of Black men once they're dead. In both of those situations, Black men are not driving the conversations about what it feels to be hunted, the kinds of depression and after effects of seeing people who look like you murdered and their pictures floating around the internet or on social media, what it's like to fear that you won't live between the ages of 15 to 34, which is the hot zone for Black men and boys in the United States, to fear of being a boy and never growing into a man because you're incarcerated, right? Like, there's all these demographic problems that we have with Black male vulnerability that Black men are trying to discuss and trying to talk about that gets shut down because other people are thought to be better voices than our own.
Absolutely. And so I'm going to go there. I'm going where you want to go, Dr. Johnson. So I see this question from my good brother Andre Evans. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Andre, for your constant interaction with us. But this question kind of leads me into the conversation of where I want to go. Andre says, what space authority do women have in defining masculinity? And so my question is, when Dr. Smith and I came with the idea to put together this conversation, I said to him, let's also, how do we want to fit a woman into this conversation? Because I want to make sure we have a diverse conversation. And we eventually decided on it was very important to have just Black males speaking on this conversation of defining Black masculinity, because I think one of the gents just said a moment ago, because there are always other voices speaking on our behalf and defining our own masculinity. Dr. Curry, you talk about this notion of the constant need for to have Black overseers.
Yes.
Talk about what you mean with that, and all you gentlemen can kind of come in and chime in on this particular topic.
Yes, I'll be very, very specific. I think that when we have conversations about Black men and boys, one of the ways that we always introduced the idea that they're perpetrators of violence is to have people who are not Black men in that conversation. So when we often entertain public conversations on social media, especially on liberal networks and media, there's always this reminder: no matter how many Black men are killed, remember, they're also abusers, they're also rapists.
Right.
And this is the driving dialogue of how we want to interpret or define masculinity. We always define them through a perpetrator lens. In my own work, I've shown that one of the major reasons that this happens is because the first debates about Black masculinity that's happening in the 1970s and 80s are coming from criminology. So the ideas of patriarchy, the ideas of domestic abuse and rape are all done by criminologists who are putting this out into what would now be social media, or back then was simply journalism. These were the debates driving this. So today, what do we have? We have panels where Black men are talking about they're killed, and we'll have someone say, oh, but don't forget about the women. Don't forget about Black men who also rape people. Don't forget about Black men who are killed. And that's fine and dandy. Nobody has to pretend that Black men are perfect. But the problem is, if you're reminding people that every time a black man is shot, it could have been good for society, then you're truly not humanizing the people that have been killed. And I think that it's time that we understand that this is a disciplinary, because it happens in the academy, and it's a political strategy that people have used to make sure that black men remain caricatures and stereotypes of deviance, rather than full persons that are in need of policies and strategies to deal with their vulnerability.
Hop in there, Dr. Smith.
So let me kind of add on, particularly when we talk about the work of criminology, because once again, I deal with the work of how the prison becomes a social construct to trap and kill black males. And so there's always been this sense of when, for instance, when black males gather, right? Like, you remember, you think of the idea of when black males gather on the street corner, then the police has to show up, right? Like there's always this way, for instance, when black males come together, there's something going on. So let me be clear about this, because there's something that we have to make sure that I think we need to do, is that this conversation is not about black women. It is specifically about black men. And so when we say, for instance, that this conversation, when the conversation around black masculinity and black males needs to take place, what I think we're suggesting is that black men should have the authority and the comprehension to have that conversation the same way that black women can have a conversation about black womanhood and not invite black males to the conversation, but rather suggest that we listen. I'm wanting to suggest that we need to authorize, that's kind of deferring, but we need to authorize black males with that type of power over our own agency. And I'll leave it at this, and the reason why that happens, because what my research shows is that in the kind of social constructive context, right, that only in African-American communities is the idea of what it means to be a man defined by women. Only in the black community does that happen. No other community has that. And I think the part of the reason that happens is because black women have had to, for very political and social reasons, be the defenders and the protectors and somewhat the shield of black life, right? Like that's just the reality. They've had to stand there for black men in order for black men to survive. Like they just had to, because they were killing black men. Like that's just the truth. Yeah. But I think what we also have to recognize that we can't be conditioned within our own oppression, which means that eventually we have to step outside of the box that we have been constructed in to be critical of it, so that we might create new images and mythologies that will allow us to move forward as people, black and white, and even men, male and female, and non-binary.
So let's go here, and I thank you all for kind of walking us through this. But as we talk about masculinity, and I think Dr. Johnson maybe mentioned this in his opening comments, kind of toxic masculinity or fragile masculinity has entered into the discourse as it relates to how some people think that some black men are homophobic, or they have to exert and to show off their masculinity in some type of way, when under the surface there may be something else going on. Kind of talk about, well, let me define it. Fragile masculinity refers to anxiety felt by men who believe they are falling short of cultural standards of manhood. Dr. Curry, I'll come to you on this one. What are your thoughts on fragile masculinity?
I mean, unless you're talking about white people, I think it's a ridiculous concept.
Okay.
I mean, these are not theories that were developed to describe black men. These are theories that are imposed on black men. Okay. And notice the definition. When you say their cultural concept, whose culture? So are you saying that black men who don't live up to the standards of white masculinity somehow interpret these anxieties and commit violence? Well, that seems strange to me, because when we look at the rates of violence, child abuse, intimate partner violence, et cetera, we see that there's parity between genders in many cases, right? So the problem is that it sees masculinity, or black masculinity, as the origin and locus of all kind of deviance. It says that if something's wrong, that black men don't feel they're men, the way they remedy that is to act out. But again, when you look at the actual literature, how you study black men, you see that black men's reaction to that is to redefine their family models, to change their definitions of manhood. so that if they can't, for example, get jobs, then they turn into the home, which is why you have black men who spend more time with their children, who have more egalitarian notions of housework than white men. When it comes to issues of whether or not black men think that women should be president or hold political office, you see that black men are far, far beyond white men and white women in terms of their views of whether or not women should lead. So it's to say that black men's only way of dealing with the frustration of racism and white supremacy is to internalize a frustration and then let that out into the world as aggression is a theory that's created by white people like John Dole in the 1930s, but has very little resonance with what we actually know about black men. And this is why Dr. Smith's comment about these theories coming from literature and people with English degrees is so important. When you look at the social science data, when you look at the psychology, I have to give a shout out to Dr. Wisdom Powell on this. When you look at the work that she's doing on how do black men actually think and respond to these kinds of a frustration, aggression is not the only pathway, right? Redefinition, pulling yourself into the community, being a family man, putting race first, being a resistor of inequity and injustice. These are the kinds of models that we see. So fragile masculinity and toxic masculinity speaks to a very specific excess of white masculinity. And that's been used to talk about black men, not because black men have power, not because black men have said it, but because it's been a way to interpret the disproportionate rates of violence in the black community, where black men are fortunate locus.
Dr. Johnson?
Yeah, I want to add that's and this is the danger of the kind of scholars that Dr. Curry and Dr. Smith were talking about, especially in terms of black feminist frameworks, because they end up kind of authorizing or reauthorizing these old white concepts, because as we are considered a black community, them actually reinvoking those gives it authority, gives it justification, and in a sense to the mainstream public suggests that they must be inherently true if these black women are authorizing these very old concepts, right? So I attend Black Studies conferences, and one of the things that I notice, especially in regard to the whole issue of black men speaking for themselves, is there tends to be 10 times, and I've counted 10 times as many presentations on women and girls by women than black men speaking about black men. Or
why is that? Why is that?
Well, really, it goes back to education. We can take it back to high school graduation rates, the number of black women in college, in graduate school versus men. But they tend to be overrepresented. But there's still a sense that they can speak on men and boys while at the same time speaking about women and girls. But black men are not welcome to speak about women and girls unless they are using the talking points that black feminists have already popularized. Otherwise, they're shunned. Otherwise, they're openly critiqued. That pattern of who gets to talk about what becomes a framework that needs to be understood. I attended a conference where one of the presenters actually argued, and it was a woman, that all we really need to talk about black males, and this is a conference in 2016, I think, all we really need is to watch the film Boys in the Hood. And Boys in the Hood would stand as a paradigm for understanding anything that's going on with black males. This is a black woman at an Africana Studies conference, right? So I'm saying, wait a minute. I mean, how is it that you can have the authority to do that, but you don't even get to see men sitting on those panels? It's not even a requirement. There was a discussion on Dr. Curry's page last week about which people get to be represented on panels at conferences. And one of the gentlemen said, well, we need to make sure there's diversity if we're going to have any conversation on black men. And I posed the question, well, how come there's no diversity when we have conversations about black women? And there was silence. That's the kind of framework we have to use, because as Dr. Smith alluded to, these literary, feminist scholars who get to frame this discussion are doing so in highly problematic ways that we don't generally get to answer. And in other words, how do you explain in The Color Purple how one gentleman, Danny Glover's character, ends up being able to frame black manhood?
Black men.
We all
you know
miss
what I mean? I mean, you think about how many black men at that time lived in a big house and ran their own farm. I mean, just reality. There's a scene that's only about 10 seconds long where Celia is reading a book and walking. She's reading a letter from her sister, and she walks by these black men who are working on a railroad. Now, we don't know if they're Gandhi dancers. We don't know if they're prisoners, but they're working there. I'm like, that 10 seconds probably reflected more about the average black man at that time period than Mr. ever did. But somehow Danny Glover's Mr. became the paradigm for black men post 1980. It just makes no sense whatsoever.
Can I ask this really quickly? So let me tell you why this is problematic. It is problematic because then we have anecdotal experiences.
Yes.
that oversee and overshadow the real social science data, what we
Yes.
know scientifically. So what do people will say? Well, I know black men who did such and such, such and such. And I'll ask the question, well, how many black men do you think you know? Because scientifically, you don't even know 1% of the black men in this country. So so we then don't look at social science data. But if we look at social science data, here's what we learned. One, when black males are in leadership, guess who they actually hire more of? Black women. When black men are engaged in community development, guess who they are most thinking about? Homes and family and single motherhood. So when you start thinking about what black men actually do through social science data, and not just through your limited experiences of black men, who, in my opinion, is your experiences are locked into a social and a cultural ethos that doesn't allow you to see the full totality of black males, is a problem. So then you start to create a reality that only reinforces what white people have been trying to project onto black men since we have gotten here. And what I want to suggest is that when we authorize black men to actually be a part of the conversation, and let me be clear, black men who also study and work in the work, we don't have to always go to an actor and a singer and a hip hop artist.
You're saying let's get some scholars on the top.
Let's get people who actually work in this work, right, to start to really help our communities. Because if we don't do that, then we just reinforce notions that were actually meant to marginalize, oppress, and literally kill us. And so then we become immune to the deaths of people like Trayvon Martin, who was actually living with his father when he was killed.
Wow. Speak on it. But I don't want people to miss the moment. Understand what Dr. Curry has initiated with the Man Not is a call to arms, is a call
Man
to action.
Is Dr. Curry's latest text.
Well, not his latest. The man is let's be clear. He's probably written 3 books since then. And
he's a writer, brother. He's a writer.
Let's be clear. That's not his latest. But I want you to understand the moment. I don't want it to slip by. What Dr. Curry's done, and this goes back to what Dr. Smith was just saying, is he initiated a push not only for black men to speak for themselves, but to use data. Because that anecdotal practice that had become normalized, especially since the 1980s, had become the paradigm that people use to talk about black men. Dr. Curry initiated a push toward empirical data and showed how that can be used. And that was the power of the Man Not. He gave us a framework to because look, most of the time we haven't had a vocabulary. Black men didn't have an overt gender movement, particularly in the 1970s and 80s. You didn't see you had periods where you saw black men speak for themselves, but they didn't have a widespread gender movement the way feminists did, the way women did. So we didn't have a vocabulary for how to do that. Much of the time, the kind of discourses we had were in barbershops, amongst each other here and there. And then our spaces got to be considered toxic in and of themselves. So women came into those spaces and diluted the discourse. So then you had to wait for, in mainstream culture anyway, comedians, maybe the occasional, I mean, you could listen to Eddie Murphy, you could listen to Chris Rock, you had individual people, maybe some hip hop artists that may drop some things here and there, but we didn't really get to see a widespread discourse because black men were not allowed to have these conversations without supervision. Curry's book, The Man Not, introduces a new framework that gives men the vocabulary, the rationale, and the historical narrative to reintroduce a discourse on black men that many of us didn't know how to have, including those of us with doctorates who are sitting in these universities.
Let me jump in here for a moment. Just pause, because this is some hot fire. Dylan. This is some hot fire right here that well, essentially this is the Marlon Smith, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Curry show, and I'm just here just facilitating the conversation because y'all didn't come to see me. Y'all came to hear these scholars talk about this particular topic and the importance of defining black masculinity by black scholars who work in the field, and making sure that we are the ones having this conversation. Let me switch gears just a little bit. In this incredible conversation. Keep the comments coming. We see you. We appreciate you. Hit the like button. Hit the heart button as well. Somebody asked for you all's names as well. Dr. Tommy Curry, Dr. Hasan Johnson, and Dr. Marlon Smith, who are all great authors and writers and have great texts that you can get at some point. In all of this conversation, we talk about Black masculinity. How do we think about Black, gay, and queer men in this discussion of Black masculinity as we continue to define it? Are Black, gay, and queer men overlooked and misunderstood in this conversation of Black masculinity? Dr. Smith?
Definitely, right? So I exist in these queer spaces all day, all night, and I understand that oftentimes what we do is we think that somehow Black men are persecuting Black, queer, and gay men. Mm-hmm. And really, when we look at policy and when we look at culture, we find that Black women are advancing those same type of discriminatory behaviors around queer and gay Black men, right? Mm-hmm. And so that what we ultimately advance, right, are these narratives around Black masculinity and Black manhood, right? And so then we'll have conversations around the DL thing, right? Like, you know, so every kind of conversation happens around DL this or DL that. So if a man is wearing his pants baggy, right, then he must be DL. And I just had a conversation with somebody else the other day about this. Like, I don't know any gay or queer men who actually sag their pants like that. So what are you talking about? So the real problem that we have when we start having these conversations of black maleness is that it is framed under the rubric of white male experiences, right? So we don't get a chance to really have the diverse conversations that we really need to have. Because if we look at the history of Black people in this country, Black gay men, from Bayard Rustin to Langston Hughes to James Baldwin, have all been a part of the work of Black liberation. Black people have not historically had a problem with James Cleveland leading our church music and being the father of gospel music in the United States, right? What we had a problem with was the way in which white people seem to perceive Black people, and that include us trying to frame ourselves in a way that would make white people more comfortable with us. But that's again why I say we need to go back and reimagine how we exist in this world, and we don't need to do it by advancing the oppressor's mentality about who we are as a people. I just think that that's limiting.
Dr. Curry, Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, listen, gay Black men are still Black men. When you look at any of the demographics, HIV, rates, incarceration, criminal profiling, depression, anxiety, issues of self-esteem, internalization of homophobia of gay Black men or men who have sex with other men in our own communities. There's no distinction there besides the positive identity categories that we put onto it. And I say it that way because it's especially important. We are going to always have issues in our community because our community is extremely conservative religiously. We're always going to have issues about whether or not certain sexual orientations are the normative or correct sexual orientations. But here's the problem. The problem is that the way that we've talked about this deposits all the homonegativity and homophobia in our communities on straight Black men. And I'm not saying that to scapegoat anyone else, but I'm saying that because I want people to understand that Black men, there are Black men who have homophobic ideas. There are Black men who very clearly articulate that they do not like or they fundamentally disagree with the same-sex couplings in our community. However, there are also Black women, there are Black Christians, et cetera, that also have these attitudes. Black masculinity is not the origin of this. Things like church attendance, education, class background, neighborhood, region of the country, all matter in terms of which groups express homophobic ideas. So that being said, the conversation we need to be having is how men who have sex with other men or how gay Black men actually exist as Black men in this world. How do they experience racial profiling? What are we going to do with the increasing rates of HIV infection in our community? What's the psychological health and well-being of this population? In what sense are their political needs not being met? The focus then becomes on the people victimized by these issues. And that's not the question that we're having today. Today, we're still trying to reinvent the notion that straight Black men are the enemy of every other kind of Black people. And again, I can't highlight it enough. That language, that discourse is very clear from criminologists that want to justify the incarceration of Black men at large in the 1970s and early 1980s. The biggest fear that I have is that much of what we take to be progressive language or masculinity in our communities, the people who are driving this conversation, claiming that they're interested in multiple voices, diverse voices, are using it to criminalize Black men as deviants, even if they have not committed a crime, but violating the policy of attitudes and progressive liberal thought. When on the other hand, our communities have this problem. We need a massive resocialization of our communities, of our churches, of our women, because the attitudes between Black men and Black women on this issue are not vastly different. Our first priority should be the care of these Black men who are having sex with other Black men, are being disproportionately affected by forces of discrimination, anti-Black racism, or a general lack of self-worth. And outside of that conversation, the rest of it is just scapegoat.
Yeah. Dr. Johnson?
Nah, I think Dr. Curry killed it. Let's just put that out there.
Drop the mic. So let me switch gears here just a little bit. Great conversation. Y'all keep this heat coming. Damien Jones podcast talking about how we define Black masculinity with 3 Black scholars. I think this is a moment in history where, and I know many of you in the comments are enjoying this, that we have 3 well-decorated Black scholars talking about how we define Black masculinity. Dr. Johnson, I'll start with you on this one. What are the social, political, and cultural implications that arise because of the way that we think about Black males? And I know that's kind of a loaded question. You can take that a lot of places.
So I mean, I don't even know where to start. You know,
just go with political. Let's go with political. What are some of the political implications
of how we think about Black males
that arise and how we think about black males?
Well, I think one of the political ramifications of how we think about Black males is that there's no policy, because Black males are considered disposable and invisible. So like I was saying earlier, when we talk about Black male death, you have every other group and every other demographic advocating for that Black male's death to stand for their politics, but you don't see organizations building out of that funds for research or funds for nonprofit organizations that end up building around how do we stem the tide of Black male deaths. What you see is those resources being extended to every other group that finds it useful. So Black males do not benefit politically on their own behalf for their own deaths. And I think that is the paradigm across the political framework that Black males experience. Our absence from the discourse outside of being visible martyrs becomes the framework for how policy is set. It's not set in our interest, right? So whether you're going to talk about it in terms of policy, but we could also talk about it in terms of voting, right? Black men actually, as I said earlier, vote at Democrat at the second highest level of Black women, but nobody talks about the fact that Black males suffer from voter disenfranchisement more than any other group due to incarceration. But somehow we don't get that credit. We don't become politically useful in that process where we're even identified as a demographic that needs to be catered to. And so we, again, remain invisible, people remain oblivious to Black males' needs or interests outside of what role our abuse and deaths can stem for them. And I say abuse because, again, it's not just our killings. Like, even if you see us beaten, even if you see us attacked, even if you see us tased for no reason with our hands up, all of that becomes a political football for every other group but Black men. So I think that's the kind of framework that I see when we think about the political ramifications. It's an absence in terms of how it benefits Black males.
There's also so let me frame this in 3 ways. First, around criminal justice. 90 of the 2.1 million people that are currently incarcerated in our country, literally almost 50%, 49.8% are African American Black bodies. Of that, almost 50%, 90% of them are Black males, right? That's one. So there's a real consequence to the way we erase Black males, just when it comes to the way we and how we do and think about policing of Black bodies and the profiteering on Black labor and those types of things. The other part that we come and talk across then becomes something that is actually connected to the criminal justice system, that is education. So that when we can look at certain districts that almost have a 50% high school dropout rate amongst Black boys, right? But then when we try to create interventions around that, then the conversation is, well, why are we having interventions specifically just for Black boys, right? I'm working with a group of called Black Males Educators United. And the question was asked, well, we will never get funding for this program design that we're working on because we're talking about just Black boys. even though Black boys have the highest high school dropout rate, they have the highest unemployment rate. We have a decreasing income disparities, even amongst Black women, where Black women are going up and Black males are going down, which goes to the third point, which is where Black males are given opportunities for leadership. So that when you start thinking about Black males in leadership, for instance, let's talk about nonprofit organizations that are supposed to be working around our community disparities, around poverty, education, housing, and the like. What we find is that Black males are often not in leadership in nonprofit sector jobs, so that we are not actually at the table producing the types of programs and initiatives that would actually
from our lens.
From not just from our lens, but we don't get a chance to. You have, I work in nonprofit. If you're not at the table in the executive seat, then there's several things that happen. You direct where funding goes. So if you look across the nonprofit sector across this country, where does most funding go? Even for when we start now talking about criminal justice, most funding goes towards women and women programs. So you can have nonprofits that have triple $1 million, over $5 million, $10 million budget, and they have no program specifically designed to address and deal with, forget Black boys of color at all. And so we have to think about the criminal justice system and how that is tied to the education system, and how that education system and those disparities are tied to nonprofit leadership, and the way in which those disparities in those places call for the ongoing displacement and erasure of Black males and the issues that Black males face.
Yeah. So let me go here. I always want to make sure that we have a solutions kind of oriented conversation as well. So I think we need to tell our audience, how do we fix the issue of other folks defining Black masculinity? Number one. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say, a lot of times in these discussions, I hear the question of solutions come up very fast, right? Very quickly, because people want to get out of the discussion about how bad things are. But I'm saying, look, Black men have been silenced and siloed in so many ways that to develop a solution when you don't have a full grasp of the problem is going to be a problem in and of itself. And I'm not suggesting you're doing this, Damien. Yeah. I'm saying that this is how I see discussions go. Well, we've heard enough about that. Let's get to the solutions. And I'm like, wait, pump your brakes. Right. There are so many issues as it pertains to Black males. We have to have a full grasp of the problem. Another problem that we grapple with is how our educational training frames how we perceive each other and how we end up being pitted against each other. What do I mean? Well, in California, there's a 75% illiteracy rate for Black boys in the K through 12 that goes on. Very little, policy around that, very little activism around that, right? In and of itself a problem. In the Cal State system in which I teach, across the entire state, 70% of Black males drop out their first year, right? So between a 75% illiteracy rate in K through 12, 70% of Black males dropping out their first year in the Cal State system, very little discourse about any of that. But when you develop a program, and this goes back to what Dr. Smith was saying, when you develop a program that targets Black males, the first thing you hear from other Black folk is, what about Black women and girls? Well, they're the highest enrolled demographic in the country. What do you mean? That's not the point. You can't have a program for boys without having a program for girls, but the girls need it. That's not the point. We got to have the program because, if you're going to have it for boys, you have to have it for girls. Well, and then, what about LGBT? And what about, so the point is, all of that comes about because we have the way we're trained in college, around the curriculum wise, we're not trained to engage how to actually tease these issues out. We're given women's studies departments that focus on feminism, Black feminism, and they focus on Black LGBT issues, but we don't have Black male studies. You have to go to Edinburgh, where my good brother, Dr. Curry is, to get Black male studies.
Wow.
So that way, anytime you try and address a problem specific to Black boys, you're immediately confronted with everything we've learned about gender and sex in college, as it relates to race, strictly from a Black feminist standpoint, because that's the only framework that's welcome. Try to get something published, either in an academic journal or an academic book that speaks from a masculinist standpoint, and watch how quickly you'll be denied.
So let me say this. It's great information. What I'm hearing from all of you is a frustration and not a frustration at any particular group, not a frustration at women, not a frustration at LGBTQ community and others, but I think it's just a frustration of we want our own space to have our own conversation to define what Black masculinity looks like instead of being somewhat marginalized. Is that somewhere? Am I somewhere accurate in that?
I mean, I think there is a frustration, but we have to be very clear that the people profiting off of the demonization of Black men it goes across all groups. There are Black men who profit, right? To be the good Negro is especially valuable in the academy today. You get lots of grants to show that you think the Black men are a problem as well. Some of those people are Black feminists. Some of those people are white feminists. Some of them are white men who are liberals. Everybody stands to gain something from showing Black men are demons, savages, and rapists. If it's something like a hiring committee at a university, if you have 3 Black men and 2 Black women or a white woman, if you can convince people that the Black men are going to be aggressive and they're going to be problems, you've already eliminated half your competition. So these things have a very real currency in the real world. I think the question of whether or not people are against certain groups is really interesting, because I would challenge anyone to look at the work of any of the scholars that's on this panel or any of the people that work in Black male studies across the country, and you don't see any kind of stereotypes. So even though, for example, I work on women who sexually abuse and rape young Black boys, I don't have a stake in calling Black women rapists, because I know that's not the case. I don't have even though I know Black women have extremely negative views about Black men, that's not the majority of Black women. Over 80% of our relationships are positive, not negative, right? So, but when you look at who's actually trying to demonize whole groups of people, that's not coming from Black men studying men. That's coming from people who, like bell hooks, like people who are reading white feminist texts, assimilating these kinds of stereotypes. So the issue just isn't marginalization. The issue is that there has been deliberate academic, political, and nonprofit sector of the United States that fundamentally is driving its industry by introducing into the American public culture that Black men are still rapists, sexual deviants, criminals, and other sorts of problems that need to be dealt with. And because there's not another side of that system, because there's no one else saying, look, here's the data showing how progressive Black men are. Why are we having conversations about Black men turning conservative when not only are they the second most voting group for the Democratic Party, but they're some of the most progressive people. They're more progressive than every white group you have. So why are white women trying to tell the public Black men should be more progressive when Black men are more progressive than them on issues of women's rights issues?
Talk about it.
Because this is what I'm saying. These are deliberate and institutional strategies that didn't socialize groups of people into this. So when we're having debates about whether or not men abuse women, whether or not Black men are abuse same-sex couples or individuals, these kinds of conversations are coming from a perpetrator lens that says we have to hold straight Black men accountable for being criminals. Nobody cares about what's happening, what woman's initiating. Nobody cares about the tremendous rates of intimate partner violence in our communities in same-sex couples, in lesbian and queer couples, right? So how are we interested in domestic violence? How are we fundamentally interested in the dynamics of our families and communities if the only people we're interested in are blaming young Black men and boys as if they're the problem? And let's be very clear. We've removed the hundreds of thousands of Black men from our communities. 1.5 million have gone missing. That was only from the 24 to 35 demographic. The 15 to 24 demographic is even worse in terms of homicide.
Is there talk about that though?
No. I mean, outside of the fact that somebody reported it, that's not been a center of any conference that I know of. But the point is, look at how many Black men are missing in these age cohorts. The violence hasn't decreased. So that should tell you something about your theory. If Black men are the problem and Black men are being eliminated and things are not getting better, then what is the stake in having Black men removed or criminalized in our communities? Why are we not focused on economic policy? Why are we not focused on decriminalization? These are the types of things that disproportionately affect Black men and boys that have not been introduced because it renders the concept of the Black male criminal void and null in explaining Black social existence.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dr. Johnson.
Right, just real quick. It even happened in your chat a second ago. One of the messages you put up, somebody accused the panel of being patriarchal, and in terms of advocating for a Nation of Islam type of patriarchy. Let me just pose a question: which of the three of us said anything about advocating patriarchy? And that's not to say we don't or we do. I'm not saying that. I'm not even getting into that. I'm saying the subject was never brought up, but the accusation was made. My question is, to what extent, and I think that's reflective of my question, to what extent are people actually listening, even when Black males get on a platform to be heard? To what extent are they actually listening to what's being said versus invoking stereotypes about what they imagine Black men are articulating? Because if you listen to what we were actually saying, nobody said anything about that.
Right. So powerful conversation. This is my last question because I gotta get out of here. I gotta spend some time with my wife, but I really appreciate this powerful conversation. But what do we need to do, gentlemen? As we talk with Dr. Marlon Smith, Dr. Hasan Johnson, and Dr. Tommy Curry, what do we need to do to help Black males have a greater stake in the world and a greater sense of security in our world? And I'll throw that one to anybody.
So I think the first thing that we have to do is that we have to employ Black men and Black male organizations to invest in the work of Black boys and males, right? Like unequivocally.
What does that look like?
Well, one, for instance, we have to ask Black fraternity organizations to create organizational structures that create economic resources that employ and educate Black males in Black male spaces. In other words, it's not just enough to create a scholarship or to go to a school or to mentor a Black boy in a white school. We need to ask where are more Morehouses at the K through 12 level. I think that, and we have within us the possibility and the probability of doing that, and the probability is greater because we have more resources than that available to us. I think the other thing is, once we start to ask Black male organizations and Black male leaders to literally invest in that, then the other thing that we have to do is we have to have greater conversations with Black women. We have to incentivize conversations that actually do bring Black women experiences to the conversation, so that we can have those. But here's what we also have to do. We have to not normalize those to heteronormative behaviors that exclude the experiences of Black, gay, and queer men, right? Because Black, queer, and gay men can have a different conversation about the relationship and the dynamic between them and Black women that straight Black men don't have. Absolutely. And so we have to begin to do that. And I think that the third thing that we have to do is we have to stop asking people to, and Dr. Johnson said this, and I'm just going to repeat it. We got to stop asking people who are victims of the problem to construct the solutions without fully investigating why the problem exists, right? So in other words, stop trying to hurry up and make us give you an answer when we're not sure that you fully understand the problem. And some of the responses that we have seen is a great example of we can't get to an answer until we start helping people understand more fully the problem.
Yeah. Dr. Johnson?
Okay, I'll be real brief. I think what we have to do, and I agree with everything Dr. Smith said, what I would undergird that with goes back to the curricular shift that I think needs to happen. Because even if you, and I'm not saying that Dr. Smith is advocating for this, but if you engage in activity, in action, without having reframed your understanding of not only the problem, but the discourse, then you're not, the solution is not going to address the problems. So I think that curricular shift needs to happen. And I think one of the things that I think works is, and Dr. Curry, may speak to this when he gets up there, is to really advocate for Black male studies, so that we can actually, again, have a better understanding of the situation, the context, the history, the narratives. I advocate for, alongside with Black male studies, a lot of my work advocates for Black masculinism, which is basically to address men on actually humanistic terms, to address Black men in particular on terms that humanize them, but better understand what they're enduring, what they're experiencing from their own vantage point, especially from their own voices. And I think, to me, between the two, we can change the paradigm, the framework that we're even using to conceptualize the context of our experience, and then be able to engage activism on any framework from a standpoint, a platform that actually gives us some traction and a shared vocabulary. And I think those things are critically important because Black men themselves have not really had a vocabulary. And that being said, we tend to lend ourselves to other people's platforms because without that framework to articulate our own experiences, we only have the language we've been given. And if you're college educated and you're dealing with race and you're dealing with gender, more often than not, you're dealing with either a Black feminist framework, a Black LGBT framework, and there's nothing inherently, about those that needs to be dismissed or anything along those lines. But it doesn't necessarily include narratives that Black men have been, that have been kind of piecing together, but not had a chance to formalize in any kind of major platform. And I think that ends up becoming part of the issue itself.
Absolutely. Dr. Curry.
Yes. So at risk of not repeating it, I certainly think that Black male studies offers us a new way to reformulate the paradigms that we use to study Black men. I think a few things that it highlights is the sexual vulnerability that Black men have, not only to police and white vigilantes, but the experiences of rape and sexual assault throughout society. I think the issues of domestic violence, child physical violence, child sexual abuse are things that are also highlighted by Black male studies. We need mental health facilities. We need trauma centers, clinicians, and social workers who can recognize the different forms of oppression, depression, anxiety, and disassociation in our communities for young Black boys. A lot of the things that have been attributed to Black male disengagement is also a function of trauma because they're victims of violence. I think we need to address the downward mobility of Black men in this country. I can't emphasize that enough. The idea that Black men could start off in the middle class and then fall to the bottom of the worst economic ladder comes about because we do not address job discrimination. Again, we still work with this idea that to be male is to be privileged, when practically all the scientific data we have says the exact opposite. And lastly, we need to have a political platform that's informed by data and empiricism. We need to be able to talk about the issues that afflict Black men and boys, not because someone knew a Black man or had a bad relationship with a Black man, but all Black men, straight, queer, etc., that have issues in the United States have to be able to dialogue about those issues and structure policy around preventing the consequences of those issues happening over and over again. Right now, we're spinning our wheels because we are still locked in a perpetrator frame. Yeah, Mr. Arbery was killed, but as we've seen from some of the comments, Black men are really bad people. This is what Black men are constantly having to deal with. Nobody situates the vulnerability of Black women to the fact that Black women disproportionately abuse children. Nobody's reminding people of that. But when it comes to Black men and boys, somehow the world needs to be reminded that they're rapists, that they're abusers, etc. So while we have this conversation going, I would say that we need to look at institutionalizing structures that have academic support and peer-reviewed research that allows us to better understand the vulnerability that Black men and boys have, that's not isolated only to their death and dying, but also to their sexual vulnerability and trauma.
Yeah. Wow. So what I'm hearing in the comments is, I got a little feedback. Y'all hear that? Maybe you don't. But what I'm hearing in the comments is that we probably need to, have a continual series here of this conversation, because it looks like folks really enjoyed this dialogue. So thank you, gentlemen, for bringing your knowledge and scholarship to this conversation. But two, I think maybe another part of this conversation, we need to talk about the therapeutics part of it and how we get people from a place of trauma to recovery and healing, as well as we talk about Black masculinity. So I think we can keep that conversation going for maybe a part two. If you want a part two, folks watching, go ahead and say yes in the comments, or just give us a like, or give us a heart or something like that. Gentlemen, great scholars, let me put your names back on the screen really quick so folks can see who you are. Dr. Tommy Curry, Dr. Hasan Johnson, Dr. Marlon Smith. I'll start with you, Dr. Smith. How can folks contact you and get some of your work?
So, wow, they can get the book, read the book.
What's that book?
So I've written two books. The first is entitled Restructuring Beloved Community, the Experiences of Black Male Felons and Their Impact on Black Radical Traditions. Then I also wrote a book for community entitled Voices of Our Elders in regards to the Black community. So I try not to be a salesman, because I don't want to be a salesman. That's why I hesitate with that. I really don't want to be a salesman. I want to be a change agent, and that's what I hope they can do. If they want to get in touch with me, they can email me at the University of Houston at msmith33@uh.edu, and I can get in touch with them there. They can also go to blackgreekspeak.org and get more information about the work that we're doing at the grassroots level, connecting activists and academics together to create institutional change.
Absolutely. Dr. Johnson, where can we contact you, find you, and get some of your texts?
You can start out with my website, www.thasanjohnson.com. You can also check out my YouTube page, where I've actually been making shows since last June. So it's been about almost a year now. If you put in Dr. T. Hasan Johnson and find my channel, you can find weekly videos on issues pertaining to Black men. And you can lastly check my blog, newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com, and find a number of my blog pieces there. And you can reach out through the website and, if need be.
Yeah. Awesome. Dr. Curry, close us out. How can we contact you and get some of your texts?
So I'm on Twitter at DRTJC. People who are interested in some of the work on Black male studies can check out The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood. It's on Amazon.com. Every sale helps. Or check out my research. I try to make most of the things that I write publicly available. So ResearchGate or academia.edu has lots of the peer review research that I referred to today. Or you could Google me, and I'm sure you'll find lots of interesting bits and pieces about the things that I say about anti-Black racism and Black men and boys.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been an incredible conversation as we talked about defining Black masculinity. We will continue a series. Thank you, Dr. Smith, for calling me and saying, hey, we need to talk about this, and to be a change agent, to have this important and clearly needed conversation. This is the Damien Jones podcast, where we air every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 12:30 p.m. Central Time, where we talk about news, politics, and life in a fun and informative and unadulterated way. You can find more about me and our content if you visit IamDamienJones.com. And remember to wear your mask, remember to social distance, remember to stay safe, and take what you can from today's conversation and build on it as we have more and more conversations around this. We'll talk about therapy. We'll be back on Monday, 12:30, with a really, really great show to talk more about politics and Joe Biden's crazy comments. But Dr. Marlon Smith from the University of Houston, Dr. T. Hasan Johnson from California State University at Fresno, and Dr. Tommy Curry from the University of Edinburgh. Thank you for joining us so much. And until next time, folks, live your life with intensity, integrity, and intelligence. This is the Damien Jones Podcast.